Today, children with disabilities routinely attend the same public schools as children without disabilities. But this was not always the case. The events that have driven the gradual and progressive evolution of special education serve as a backdrop to understanding the foundation of the field and its ever changing nature. Knowledge of this history is critical if we intend to make further progress. Prior to legislation requiring public education for children with cognitive or emotional disabilities, deafness, blindness, or the need for speech therapy, among others, parents had few options other than to educate their children at home or pay for expensive private education. The story of special education begins in the early part of the 20th century. Parents formed advocacy groups to help bring the educational needs of children with disabilities to the public eye. These groups gained momentum mid century. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy created the President's Panel on Mental Retardation. The panel's recommendations included federal aid to states. In 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Elementary and School Education Act, which provided funding for primary education and is seen by advocacy groups as expanding access to public education for children with disabilities. Despite these two important events, by the 1970s, only a relatively small number of children with disabilities were being educated in public schools. In 1975, a federal law changed this with the passage of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. This act established a right to public education for all children, regardless of their disability. The next big change came in 1990 with the passage of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. IDEA required that schools provide individualized or special education for all children with qualifying disabilities. Under the IDEA, states who accept public funds for education must provide special education to qualifying children with disabilities. The IDEA sets forth specific guidelines regarding free appropriate public education, that is FAPE. Among these is the idea that education must be tailored to meet the needs of individual child with a disability. This education must be of benefit to the child and should prepare the children for further education, that is college, or to live and work independently. The IDEA also requires that education occur in the least restrictive environment and requires schools to take a child's disability into account when enforcing discipline. Although not all children with disabilities are covered by the IDEA, this act has been instrumental in ensuring a free public education to millions of children with disabilities each year since its passage. Prior to this act, parents of children with disabilities had few choices as to the education of their children. Today, these children receive their education alongside with children who do not have disabilities. It is important for all teachers to understand the 1997 and 2004 amendments of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and how they impacted students with disabilities. In the next few slides, we will discuss the six main principles of IDEA and how they are implemented in the classroom. Have you ever had the experience of being the only person in the classroom who had trouble doing something or understanding a certain concept? How would you feel if every day in school you faced the same kind of difficulty while everyone else seemed to find the work easier than you? What kind of support and teaching would you need to keep trying? The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is a law that was passed to help and support students who face this situation every day. The current version of the law was passed in 2004, but it's based on the law that was first created in 1975, known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. It revolutionized the education of children with disabilities, which in 2001 was more than 6 million children. IDEA requires that public schools provide specialized services to all children with disabilities from birth to age 21 for the purpose of granting equal access to education. A specific part of this law mandates public schools to create individualized education plans or IEPs for each student aged 3 to 21 who is found to have an eligible disability. An IEP is a document that is drawn up and agreed upon by teachers, parents, specialists, and if possible, the student. The document describes the present achievement level of the student, which specifies goals for the school year, as well as any special support needed to achieve those goals. Let's visit a fourth grade classroom to see an example of IDEA action. Meet Jen. Jen is a bright, energetic fourth grader who loves school. Jen has an hearing impairment. She is not deaf, but her hearing is poor enough that it affects her educational performance as she has trouble hearing any of her teachers. Jen would qualify for special assistance under IDEA. Her IEP would include information about her hearing impairment, such as the most recent hearing test results, and would also outline multiple goals and services agreed upon by her parents and teachers. Although Jen might meet with a specialist once or twice a week, most of her time would still be spent in the classroom with all of her fellow students. This is because another aspect of IDEA is the requirement that a child with a disability be educated in the least restrictive environment, that is LRE, as far as possible. In other words, a student like Jen who has a disability should have the opportunity to be educated with her non disabled peers to the greatest extent possible. Jen should have the opportunity to interact with her peers and have the same access to educational experiences as everyone else. Jen may just need additional resources such as visual aids to optimize her learning. Individualized educational programs and least restrictive environment are the two most well-known principles of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. There are four additional principles that you should be aware of. They are zero reject, free appropriate public education, appropriate evaluation, parent and student participation in decision making, and procedural safeguards. Let's go through each of them separately. Zero reject. Schools must educate all children with disabilities. This principle applies regardless of the nature or the severity of the disability. No child with disabilities may be excluded from public education. The next is free appropriate public education, which means that each child with a disability is entitled to free public education, just like other children who do not have a disability. The appropriate part refers to the need to determine how to best provide the child with education with respect to each child's needs. So, in the case of Jen, is receiving the same public education as other children who do not have the hearing impairment. Jen just needs some additional help to make her education appropriate for her. The next is appropriate evaluation. Children are placed in special education services through an evaluation process. If the evaluation is not appropriately conducted or does not monitor the information that is needed to determine placement, it is not appropriate. The goal of IDEA's regulations for evaluation is to help minimize the number of misidentifications, to provide a variety of assessment tools and strategies, to prohibit the use of any single evaluation as the sole criterion or which a student is placed in special education, and to provide protections against evaluation measures that are racially and culturally discriminatory. The next principle The next principle is parent and student participation in decision making. A good family professional partnership is key for a student to receive the education necessary for success. Parents and teachers need to be willing to work together and communicate to determine the best ways of working with and providing information for a student. Parents as well as teachers are able to challenge any decisions that they feel are inappropriate for the student. The next criteria or the next principle of IDEA are procedural safeguards. Procedural safeguards are an integral part of IDEA's requirement. They represent guarantees for parents and their child with disabilities, as well as offer both school and parents a variety of options for resolving any disagreements. Some of the rights are parents' access to student records, parents' rights to ask that those records be amended, parents' rights to participate in groups and meetings, and parent notification requirements. Now, let's spend some time talking about what special education looks like today. More recent legislation, such as the No Child Left Behind Act, which is NCLB, and IDA 2004 amendments have enhanced the quality of special education programs at the state level. NCLB addresses accountability for student achievement by requiring increased participation on statewide assessments by students identified with disabilities. The law also called for highly qualified teachers, including those who teach special education or special classes. The intention of NCLB was to tighten the achievement gap between the students considered to be at risk and those who were functioning typically. IDA 2004 allows for alternative models to identify learning disabilities, such as response to intervention, which is the practice of providing high quality instruction and interventions matched to student need, monitoring progress frequently to make decisions and changes in instruction or goals, and applying child response data to important educational decisions. While RTI was primarily a general education initiative, it has a significant impact on how the school community views struggling students. Instead of sending them off to special education, the emphasis is now on preventing learning gaps from occurring and addressing minor academic and behavior issues before they become major issues. So, the question that comes up now is, where do we go from here? During the past 2 decades, the number of students with special needs being educated in the general education classroom has progressively increased. Close to 95% of students with disabilities are being educated in local general education schools, and 75% receive either full inclusion or a combination of inclusive and pull out resource room services. Professional literature increasingly speaks to how teachers can use differentiated instruction to address variance in the general education classroom without the need for specialized instruction from a special education teacher. As the trend continues to move towards including students with disabilities with their general education peers, some fear the lines between general education and special education are being blurred and that we are losing track of the most basic tenet of special education, which is individualization. While that concern is most certainly valid, the progress that has been made cannot be ignored. Whereas integration was the prominent theme in decades past, today we are accountable for education that is meaningful, formative, result oriented, and individualized for all students, not just those who are diagnosed with disabilities. Professionals today should think about and reflect on the following questions, some being, what can be learned from the history of special education? What are the underlying factors that might affect negative views from members of community, principals, and teachers? What are teachers doing to differentiate instruction for all learners? And how can I support their efforts? And the other would be, what can be learned from the history of special education? So, once again, I would like you to stop here for a minute and just reflect on some of these questions that we have discussed. By placing current issues and trends in a historical perspective, professionals can appreciate how far the field of special education has come and promote further advancement. With the passage of the key special education laws more than 30 years ago, parents and educators celebrated the fact that students with disabilities were granted the right to education. Today, we can want to ensure that students with disabilities do not only have access to educational rights, but that they are entitled to a meaningful education that facilitates learning at all levels and produces measurable outcomes. The road ahead may be marked with obstacles, but remember, we must keep moving forward.